possibly one of the best sword designs of the 18th and 19th centuries, the CJM pattern and its inspiration. Hi folks, Matt Easton here, Schola Gladiatoria. Now I've done a much lengthier video talking about the CJM pattern, and in fact if you want to know all of the details I'm going to link an article I wrote down below on the Easton Antique Arms website. Okay, so there's a huge amount more detail in there in what is CJM. CJM stands for Charles James Mitchell. Now Charles James Mitchell was involved in the volunteer movement in the Victorian period, but he designed this type of blade. And we're not going to talk that much about him at all, we're going to talk about the blade here. So what is special about this blade? Well, first of all, let's set some context. So I'm going to grab a regulation blade of the time here, which was known as the 1845 pattern blade. Ignore the hilt, okay? At this time you could have cavalry hilts, Royal Engineers hilts like this, Royal Artillery hilts, infantry officers hilts, rifle hilts, doesn't really matter. From 1845 onwards, for most of the rest of the 19th century, in the British military, and in fact very similar blades in other militaries, they used this type of blade, which is characterised by having a single fuller up the base of the blade here, and then for the last 6 or 8 inches it becomes what's known as a spear point, which is actually double-edged and symmetrical, better for thrusting. This is very strong for cutting. So that is the 1845 blade, attributed to Henry Wilkinson. If you've ever bought a Wilkinson razor blade, or perhaps a Wilkinson garden tool of some sort, that's where Wilkinson swords started out making these things. In fact, this is a Wilkinson example. So Henry Wilkinson devised this model of blade in around 1844, which is when Wilkinson started making swords, previously being a gun maker, basically taken over the business of Henry Knock, you might know, from the Napoleonic period. But anyway, he went into making swords in 1844, and by 1845, this model of blade, which he designed, had become regulation in the army. In 1846 it became regulation in the navy, and it remained the regulation blade, the standard blade, for most of the rest of the 19th century. Now that should speak volumes by itself, because it was a very successful model of blade. It combines many different features, it's a very effective blade. It wasn't utterly new, I've talked about this in previous videos. It does have some comparisons in earlier styles of blade, even Mongol swords surprisingly, but having a fullered base of the blade up here, it's a pretty rigid, pretty strong but also fairly light cutting blade, and then having that spear section at the end there, double-edged, means that obviously you've got a better thrusting point and the capacity for false edge cuts, although that's secondary to the fact that it's better for thrusting. So the 1845 pattern blade was the regulation sword of the time. Now, that being the case, and humans being who they are, everybody's got an opinion, yeah? If 10 of you out there give me your opinion, I'll probably get 10 different opinions. Some of them might overlap, some of them might be related, some of them might be completely contrary to each other. And in the 19th century we have something which is known as the cut versus thrust debate, which in a nutshell means that some people in some places at some times thought that the cut was a far more effective mode of attack than the thrust, or that the thrust was a far more effective mode of attack than the cut. Now obviously most swords combine these two features, but not always in a 50-50 balance. Some swords are a little bit more catered towards thrusting, like a rapier. Some are a little bit more catered towards cutting, like a falchion, for example, and some are kind of in the middle, like your typical broadsword or sabre. But in some parts of the world, some people anecdotally found that thrusting was a far more effective mode of attack, and so therefore they skewed their designs more towards thrusting, while other people found, for example, like cavalry in India, sometimes found that cutting was more effective for various reasons, the point not getting stuck in the target, blah blah blah. And so they made more cutting swords, more curved blades, perhaps slightly broader, slightly different cross-section, this kind of thing. So we end up with this fantastic area, which is my main obsession behind the camera, which is non-regulation Victorian fighting swords. Now this is obviously a very specific and narrow field, but it's the one that I've chosen to specialise and become obsessed in. So this is where the CJM pattern comes into the equation, into the world. Basically people who weren't happy with the standard regulation blade, which is actually perfectly good, perfectly effective, I've personally used it for all sorts of things for many years, and it's great. Okay, but some of the non-regulation, some of the optional and different blades are also great. So I'm just going to give a couple of examples before getting back to the CJM blade. This was a very popular model of blade, and it's known as the Toledo pattern because Spanish swords actually had this feature and the British copied it. So the basic feature is the bottom half of the blade is like a bar and completely blunt, which for stiffness and for parrying is fantastic. And in fact, this almost certainly plays a role in the development of later models of sword, which we won't look at here, the 1892 pattern, for those of you who are wondering. So essentially we've got a bottom half of the blade. It's actually slightly, on this example it's slightly less, it's more like 40%, but on some of them it is 50%, some of them it's 60%. So it varies a bit, but about half, bottom of the blade, is a completely blunt bar, blunt back, blunt front, but you'll notice it has these two fullers, and the two fullers are just there to reduce the weight because otherwise that bar would be quite heavy. So the fullers are only there for weight reduction, okay? They weren't usually referred to as fullers actually at the time. Fullering, a fuller is the tool, but usually they were referred to as things like gutters and things like that. But anyway, grooves. They were referred to as grooves as well actually. So grooves front and back, completely blunt, for parrying and defending because you're not going to be cutting anyone with the bottom of the blade. The second half of the blade is essentially like a rapier. Okay, it's double-edged and as you can see relatively narrow. Now this is the formula that makes the Toledo pattern blade, and that was a fairly popular model of blade. Some are wider, some are longer, some are shorter. Sometimes the bottom half of the blade is longer or shorter. They vary, but overall that's the standard formula for the Toledo model blade. And this was a standard optional blade offered by Wilkinson, and not hugely uncommon. I've got a few of them in my collection, maybe about 8 in my collection. You find them on all types of swords, cavalry, infantry, and naval swords as well. Okay, so essentially a rapier blade, but with a thick parrying base of the blade. Really, this is overall more catered towards the thrust. This specific example, this belonged to an officer of the Lancers, incidentally. But some of them are broader and a bit more cut-based, and you even get something called the curved Toledo, which is actually a saber blade, and those are obviously more effective at cutting, and they tend to be a bit broader up here. So this particular one, very thrust-centric. Some of the Toledo blades, a little bit more cut and thrust. But going in a different direction, another fairly popular blade variant is this, which is essentially, in shape, a standard saber blade like the 1845, but you will notice it has absolutely no fuller, okay? And in addition, it doesn't, although it's got the spear-shaped point, it doesn't have the midrib, so it actually has a slightly beveled false edge. So you can still do the same things with it, but the whole blade is wedge, so I'll just put it down for a second so I can show it, is essentially wedge section. It's a straight wedge, so a flat back and a triangle like that. And this is known as the flat solid blade by Wilkinson. This was fairly popular, and this was overall not as, I'll do this carefully, not as stiff for thrusting, but better for cutting. Okay, so while it's got the same overall shape as a standard saber, because of the edge bevel being more direct like that, instead of having a bevel, then a fuller, then a back, you have less resistance at cutting through a target. So overall, the flat solid blade, which was used incidentally on cutlasses and all kinds of knives, of course, was seen as and things like tulwars as well, was seen as a better cross-section for a cutting blade. So some officers, like with this lovely example here, preferred more of a cutting blade. So although they're subtle, although they're not like in your face, kind of one's a whopping great massive wide blade and the other one's a really, really narrow blade, those are both within the parameters of what you might consider a normal saber. But there is enough of a difference between them that the Toledo style blade, at least that one, is much more thrust centric, and the flat solid blade is much more cut centric. What we see with the CJM blade, the Charles James Mitchell blade, is actually a combination of the two, but it was based on an earlier sword. So the basic features of the CJM blade. This is not the original hilt incident, it's original to period, but this was updated in 1897 or thereabouts. The original blade would have been a 3-bar hilt, much like the cavalry swords I was just showing, according to the Wilkinson records. So, this is essentially a completely flat solid blade, but with no edge, for the first part of the blade. Okay, this is quite a complex blade. Then you have double fullers for this part of the blade. 1 fuller, 2 fullers, with a cutting edge here. Then it transitions into what I would describe as a broadsword, or claymore as it was called at the time, blade. You've got edges front and back, it's completely symmetrical. The fuller that was the central fuller here continues, but the fuller that was the back fuller at the backsword part of the blade stops. And after that becomes double-edged for really almost the second half of the blade. So what you've essentially got in sword parlance is a backsword for the first half of the blade and a broadsword for the second half of the blade. So you've got the advantages of a backsword, which are what? Well, stiffness. It's much stronger, okay? You've got more rigidity in parrying and controlling opponents' blades, or if they're putting in a strong blow, you've got a much stronger bar of metal in front of you. And stiffness as well, which means that when you're thrusting it's a little bit more rigid. But the end of the blade is double-edged. What advantage is there to that? Well, number one, you've got 2 edges, so you can cut in both directions. But in addition, for thrusting, it's got edges front and back, so it meets less resistance, it cuts through the target, and is a more effective thrusting blade. Now, as described in that article down below, Charles James Mitchell was a volunteer soldier. He was a hobbyist, essentially, who obviously had a personal interest in swords and sword designs, and he gave these as presents. This sword was purchased from Wilkinson to the CJM design and given as a present to an officer in the Bengal Staff Corps to be taken out to India. So he wanted a decent fighting sword. So this is designed as a fighting weapon, and it's designed, at least in the designer's eyes, and perhaps the officer who owns its eyes, to be a better design than the standard 1845. Is it better? Maybe. Maybe we'll look at that in a future video. Possibly it is slightly better, but I wouldn't say there's anything wrong with the 1845, but I do really, really like these blades. Now, as mentioned, this wasn't actually CJM's design, Charles James Mitchell's design. It actually came completely copied, plagiarized from an earlier sword. And this is the earlier sword. This is a massive 39, I think, a 38.5-inch bladed cavalry backsword, we could call it, but we'll talk about that in a second. For the British cavalry, heavy cavalry, dragoons, could even be horse guards, from the middle of the 1700s. So we're going back 100 years earlier. These CJM swords were mostly made in the 1860s and 70s. Okay, so these, despite the fact they seemed like, wow, look at that cool new design that Mr. Mitchell has come up with. We didn't really. He probably took a family sword from the massive estate that he lived in and went, copy this, Wilkinson. And Wilkinson went, oh yeah, we know those, we'll make one of those. So this was actually a more than 100-year-old blade design, revived and brought back because it was so good. And it's really important to remember, we're talking about swords here, but this can apply to lots of things. Just because something was used 100 years ago and is no longer used, doesn't mean it's not good. I mean, look at Bowie knives, Bowie knife blades. You can still find them on bayonets and field knives and, you know, bushcraft knives today, but it's a design that goes back hundreds of years. And this is true of this blade as well. So essentially it has all the exact same features. It's essentially, although it's bigger in this case, it has the exact same features of the CJM blade, and was obviously, not this particular sword, but this model of sword, was obviously the inspiration for it. Blunt base of blade here, double fullers here with a central fuller and a back fuller, which goes up to about halfway up the blade. The central fuller continues, the back fuller stops, and that's where the back edge stops. Then it becomes a broadsword, double-edged blade with a spear tip for the rest of the blade. It's exactly the same. It is literally, the CJM pattern blade is actually in reality not the CJM pattern blade. It's simply an 18th century backsword blade. Now, the term backsword and broadsword are somewhat problematic. Generally speaking, for anyone who doesn't know, a backsword has a flat back, and a broadsword has double edges in 18th and 19th century parlance. The problem here is this has both, and actually that's true of lots of what we call backswords. So I personally would refer to this as a backsword, and I do, but you have to bear in mind therefore that when we're talking about backswords, it doesn't necessarily mean they are completely single-edged. Very often backswords are blunt on the back of the edge, back-edged, for half of the blade and actually edged for the end half of the blade, or even if it's not the full half, they've usually got a false edge for at least some of the back of the blade. So just because I say back sword doesn't mean it doesn't have a false edge. It can have a false edge. Now, obviously, this has a basket hilt. Basket hilts were very much something of the 18th century, okay? And they couldn't continue that in the 19th century, by and large. You could say that this isn't really a copy of that because, of course, it has a modern, up-to-date, in fact, 1897 pattern hilt on it. But that was because of army regulations. So if you were, for example, in the Royal Engineers, you had to have a Royal Engineers hilt. However, in the Victorian military, it's not so much the case in the modern military, unfortunately, because swords are just parade items now. But in the Victorian military, they accepted that the fighting part of the blade, or at least the most important fighting part of the blade, was up to you, because that was for you to defend your life with and take the life of others should it be needed. So they could choose pretty much whatever blade they wanted. So while I talk about the standard regulation blade, we could term this as the recommended blade. Okay, so the 1845 blade was recommended, and by the vast majority of people, 98% of people, had the regulation blade. But they didn't care if you had some other blade. You could have an old family blade, you could have a rapier blade, a broadsword blade, you could have some funky Indian saber blade, whatever you wanted, so long as the hilt and the scabbard met dress regulations when you were on parade, okay? So in fact, you could carry whatever sword you liked on campaign, and we know lots of British officers carried things like tulwars and various other things, even rapier in one case I know of. So you could carry whatever you liked on active service, but if you were on parade in full dress order, you had to have a hilt and scabbard that met dress regulations. So that's why we find this 18th century style blade married to a Victorian hilt. Could they have gone for the full kit and caboodle and had the full basket hilt on one of those blades? The answer is yes, they could, and they could have worn that on campaign on active service, going to Afghanistan in 1878 or whatever, or the Indian Mutiny, although they weren't prepared for the Indian Mutiny because it just happened. But you could go on active service with basically whatever you liked, and many of them did. But you wouldn't be able to wear this on parade, which would be a bit of a kicker because it would mean that you could have your lovely blade and your expensive sword you were very proud of and spent lots of money on, and you couldn't wear it with your full dress uniform. That's why they put them with regulation hilts. So sometimes, yes, we get basket hilts used by non-Highland. Highland officers still have basket hilts, in fact, so if you're in a Highland regiment, you could have this. But if you were not in a Highland regiment, you would have to use just whatever your regiment's standard hilt was, with some small leeway there, with some variations, like you could have it made of steel instead of brass and that kind of stuff. But you'd have to have but you could choose whatever blade you wanted. So there we go, the CJM pattern blade. I am a massive fan of it. This is, I know of 3 still in existence. One was sold by another dealer who you'll find in that in the article linked down below to my antique website. This one I own, and there's another one out there, and I don't know where it is currently. Oh no, I do actually, it's owned by another collector. So these do survive, and I'm sure over the years, hopefully before I die one day, I will see another one, but they are very, very rare. Now, I often get asked, literally I've had maybe 10 or 20 emails over the years saying, can you find a CJM pattern sword for me? The answer, unfortunately, is no. If I was able to find any others, I would own them. This is the only one I've ever been able to lay my hands on, okay? So the answer is realistically no, they are so rare I can't get one. But what I can do is, if you really like that blade section, recommend you get an 18th century sword, okay? If you want a sword with this model of blade, just get one of the original 18th century ones, which have exactly the same design of blade as the CJM pattern, because the CJM pattern really is a copy of those 18th century swords. Anyway, thanks a lot for watching. I hope I see you back on the channel really soon. I've been Matt Easton, and I will be again next time. Cheers, folks. Thanks for watching. We've got extra videos on Patreon. Please give our Facebook a like and subscribe if you haven't already. Cheers, folks.